I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us from our studios in Israel. Coming up in today's newscast, Americans in Israel join the March for Our Lives. The United States passes a Taylor Force Act to deter Palestinian terrorism. And you may no longer need a therapist because one Israeli startup has just figured out how to diagnose depression with just a recording of your voice. Stay tuned for the latest news in Israel. Hundreds of expats here in Israel have just marched alongside their fellow Americans to rally for gun control reform in the wake of what many say is an epidemic of mass shootings in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have taken part in the March for Our Lives all over the world, and several survivors of last month's horrific massacre at a high school in Parkland, Florida, were actually here in Tel Aviv to help rally the crowd.
I go to Douglas, and my class was shot into. I was one of the first rooms who got shot, and 3 kids in my class died. It's just been really hard because I saw things that no 14-year-old should ever have to see.
The marches seen around the world demonstrate possibly the single largest cry for gun control reform in recent U.S. history. President Trump and Republican leadership have come under fire for allegedly failing to tackle these reforms against the NRA, the most dominant gun lobby on Capitol Hill. Trump initially voiced opposition against the NRA, only to 180 several days later, suggesting instead to arm public school teachers as a means to thwart school shooters. Congress's latest spending bill, which was just signed into law by Trump, includes measures to improve background checks for buying a weapon. But retailers such as Walmart and Dick's Sporting Goods have already gone several steps further and banned the sale of assault weapons from their stores altogether. Many have pointed out how Israel's tight gun control laws and historically low school shootings may be a prime example for America to follow. Given the massive numbers seen all over the world at yesterday's march, clearly this is an issue personal to many. Well, it's finally happened. The American Congress has just passed the Taylor Force Act, meaning the U.S. will now slash funds to the Palestinian Authority unless they stop paying salaries to Palestinian terrorists and their families. This major cut now ensures that no U.S. money will ever be used to create an incentive for Palestinian terrorists. The act passed on Friday as part of Congress's omnibus budget bill. It takes its name from former U.S. Army officer Taylor Force, who was murdered 2 years ago by a Palestinian terrorist during a trip to Israel. The bill amassed massive bipartisan support from both Republicans and Democrats alike ever since. Though Palestinian leaders have already expressed their outrage, U.S. lawmakers hope the new law will help curb violence against Israeli citizens. The Palestinian Authority is well known for diverting massive amounts of money to families of terrorists who are killed in the act, as well as paying stipends for those put in prison. Attacking President Abbas's wallet may put the right kind of pressure on the Palestinians. But given recent cuts to the UN's refugee agency for the Palestinians, as well as President Trump's controversial Jerusalem decision, some worry that this may spiral the region into a desperate and violent situation. Others say this is merely a much-needed dose of reality for Palestinian leadership to finally accept. Well, Hamas says they've finally tracked down the would-be assassin of Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Rami Hamdallah. That suspect and an accomplice have been pronounced dead following a bloody shootout in the Gaza village of Beit Hanun in a firefight that also left 2 Hamas police officers dead. But despite this, Hamas and the PA are continuing to point fingers. The explosion that rocked the Gaza Strip roughly 2 weeks ago targeted not only the life of the visiting Palestinian Authority leader, but also the future of Palestinian reconciliation altogether. With talks at a standstill, PA President Abbas immediately denounced Hamas for the attempt on Hamdallah's life and also said he doubted the authenticity of any Hamas investigations. Hamas internal security forces claim they've tracked down the individual that masterminded the attack. That suspect's name is Anas Abu Hussein, a 26-year-old Gaza man with no known ties to any terror group. The slain Hamas officers have just been laid to rest, and Hamas is at least trying to approach this as an open and shut case.
أعتبر هذا إنجاز وطني لأجهزتنا الأمنية للوصول للكشف عن ملابسات هذا الحادث والقبض على المتورطين، وما زالت العملية جارية للقبض على جميع المتورطين في هذا الحادث.
Officials in Abbas's government seem unsatisfied with this result and continue to voice skepticism. Meanwhile, others wonder if the PA could have orchestrated the near miss themselves for their own reasons, or if a third terror group could be looking to take control amidst the chaos. Either way, it looks like the damage may already be done to Palestinian reconciliation. Well, the United Nations Human Rights Council has just passed 5 new anti-Israel resolutions, but only 3 against the rest of the world's human rights abusers. And now Israel and American officials are threatening to leave the world body for good. Here with more is Naftali Ben-Simon, a journalist and member of the Likud party, and Yosef Livnei, former Israeli ambassador to multiple countries. Thank you both for joining us.
Good evening.
Thank you for having us.
All right, so, Israel is constantly showing off its improving ties worldwide. Why haven't those growing relationships translated themselves into forums like the UN?
Well, I think that it's been the history since day one. The UN is like an extraterrestrial forum, if you will. Even in the best of times, there were always anti-Israeli resolutions passed there. And the Human Rights Council has been at the forefront of the anti-Israeli fora. Many nations claim that one should make a distinction between bilateral relations and the multilateral arena.
Right.
And many have said, they have no importance whatsoever. So we can placate the Arabs and the Muslims, but what really counts are the bilateral relations between you and us.
Well, I'd like you to answer our next question. The U.S., Australia, and Israel fought for Agenda Item 7, the permanent item that is at the UNHRC, against Israel to be removed. Wouldn't the U.S. and Israel be powerless if they were to leave the UNHRC?
I'm not in favor of leaving institute of UN. I think it's still in a very important arena. Even we are not key players there. Even we are always attacked. This is not good for us not to be there, because our cause, it's still something to be here in the all international arenas. And I think through the UN, we have achieved something very good during the years. So it's not just something that, okay, US and Israel should leave any UN institute there, but on the same time, it's impossible. It's impossible to live in a parallel world that one is in UN and the other one is in the reality.
Right.
And in UN, the Palestinians they are a superpower. They are like, they have almost the same achievements like United States, but in the reality, they achieved nothing.
What
and
is your take on this,
ask
Ambassador?
myself, what they want, a symbolic achievements or a real achievements? This is the real question.
I think that Naftali is right. I think that Israel should not withdraw from UN organizations. First of all, at the UNHCR, we are not members. But not every nation is a member of the council at a given time. You have to be selected, elected, or whatever. But we're not there, okay? I don't think it's such a good idea for us to leave, because we're not the United States. When the United States leave an organization, you can rest assured that the rest of the world will come and plead them to come back, because when they leave, they take the money with them.
Yeah.
So at UNESCO, when they left, people came, no,
Right.
you have to come back. When we leave, if we leave, I'm not so sure people will let us come back again.
Well, the U.S. has already left UNESCO, cut
Yeah.
funding to UNRWA. Why stay in the UN at all? Why not just pull out completely?
Because the UN is what proper people do. You stay there. You don't just,
What proper people do.
yeah, you don't just leave. And let us remember, over the years, the General Assembly, for instance, is a place where if you have good ambassadors, good representatives, this is the place where you make your case heard. And we've had great ambassadors over the years, starting with Abba Eban and Chaim Herzog and Bibi Netanyahu. And these people, when they spoke, it made headlines.
Well, these 5 resolutions that were just passed against Israel, how would they affect, I guess, the state of Israeli-Palestinian relations, if at all?
Well, of course, there is no effect. It's ridiculous. They know it, and we know it, that those resolutions that have been accepted just in this weekend are something that nothing to connect with the reality. But we don't have to forget, we have not to forget that after 70 years, and we are celebrating 70 years, the UN recognized the state of Israel. And I think that United States and Israel can change something inside the organization.
If they stay, right?
And if they stay. And I think we can see good signs from Nikki Haley and Danny Danon. They're trying to do something. I don't think that withdraw and taking a step behind and say, okay, you know what, you are irrelevant. It's the right decision or the right solution for the world, for the Palestinians, for the Israelis.
All right, well, thank you both for joining us. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. All right, guys, tens of thousands have just gathered in Tel Aviv to protest the government's controversial plan to deport nearly 40,000 African asylum seekers. Israel's High Court froze those deportations just last week, but tomorrow is the government's official deadline to either renege or double down. That plan, originally set to begin at the end of this week, would see thousands of African men deported from the country with force if necessary, and sent to a still undisclosed third country in Africa, widely presumed to be Rwanda or Uganda. The state has branded this group as illegal infiltrators, with Prime Minister Netanyahu calling them an even worse danger than Sinai terrorists. The vast majority, however, are mostly Christians from Eritrea and Sudan. They say they fled genocide and worse in their home countries for a better life in Israel. Indeed, these demographics are widely embraced as refugees in almost every developed country, and even Israel's High Court ruled that Eritreans who fled service in the mandatory army should be eligible for refugee status here. Government ministers say the deportations only target job-seeking single men for now, but Israel's own interior minister has been very clear that women, children, and families will ultimately be on the chopping block in the future. The majority of Israelis have voiced support for deporting asylum seekers from the country regardless of their age or a guarantee of safety in Rwanda or Uganda. But these massive protests, which include countless pilots, doctors, ex-diplomats, and even Holocaust survivors, demonstrate that the opposition to the deportations is only growing. 2 Jordanian terrorists have just been sentenced to 10 years in prison for the attempted bombing of the Russian, Iranian, and Israeli embassies in 2016. ILTV's Aaron Porras has more on the story. So, Aaron, first off, why target these embassies specifically?
Well, the 2 terrorists were allegedly affiliated with the Islamic State, and so it sounds like they were trying to send a message, and they were targeting the major world powers within their reach, namely Iran with the backing of Russia. And of course, the great Satan of the Middle East, Israel. But it's important to note that these are not hardly the only attempted attacks in the region either. Jordan has, just in the past month, arrested 17 different suspects in connection to ISIS plots against the United States Embassy, Jewish business officials, and other Western targets.
I mean, the Israeli and American targets are again, to show power? Is that the idea here?
That's part of it. Another more recent reason is, of course, Donald Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and it could also even potentially be the reconciliation between Jordan and Israel following last summer's fiasco at the Israeli
where 2
embassy.
Jordanians were killed by an Israeli embassy guard. Yeah. All right. Thanks for joining us. All right, after millions of back and forth reports, it's finally happened. Air India Flight 139 has just made history by being the first to fly straight from New Delhi to Tel Aviv through Saudi airspace. It's also the first Air India flight to come to Israel in over 20 years. The new historic route marks the end of a 70-year ban on flights either going to or coming from Israel, from flying over the Saudi kingdom. Riyadh has still not confirmed allowing the new route, but future flights on the Indian airline are still being scheduled for sale. Both the Indian ambassador to Israel as well as Transportation Minister Israel Katz praise a momentous occasion, hailing it as a first and many good things to come from the growing Israel-India relationship. But Katz, along with many others, also sees the new flights as a sign of the inching progress between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So far, there are still no El Al flights allowed to go to or over Saudi Arabia, but after this, there's still hope.
This is an historical moment. First time that Air India landing in Israel, and first time that the skies of the Jewish land and the most Arab important land, Saudi Arabia and Israel, are connected together through the flight of Air India. And from here, I sure and I wish that all the sky will open, including the fact that El Al and the other Israeli aviation companies could fly direct Saudi Arabia and the Arab countries.
Very cool. All right, the Me Too movement is one of the biggest social discussions of our time, and it's already changing the face of the entertainment industry all over the world. Well, an Israeli production company is mobilizing that movement into a full-fledged reality show set to expose sexual harassment in the workplace, candid camera style. Well, ILTV's Brett Allen Smith is here with the details. And Brett, how will this show work?
Well, basically each episode is going to bring hidden cameras into a real-life workplace, and not necessarily just a workplace in the entertainment field, but probably all kinds of offices. And the idea is to catch a predator, no pun intended there, in an act of sexual harassment, expose the behavior, and then confront them with it.
Well, it's an interesting concept for sure, and potentially a really important one. I mean, it also reminds me of Undercover Boss in a way too, because it explores what's behind the curtain as well as what could be potentially dangerous behavior. But it creates an interesting moral question too, doesn't it? I mean, let's talk about that.
Well, I'll be interested to see how the show deals with what happens afterwards, the aftermath. I mean, this is all going to the discussion on the other end of the spectrum happening right now, you know, which is where does the law draw the line on when a crime's actually been committed, and how does one act compare against another? I mean, depending on what these cameras find, I wonder if police get involved or when police get involved. It's
using hidden cameras is really intriguing too, especially when they're put in actual workplaces. I wonder how they legally get to do that, but I also wonder how sexual harassment is defined specifically within Israel, because I know that in the United States, according to the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, harassment doesn't only mean unwelcome sexual advances or requests for sexual favors. It can actually entail sexism. You know, for example, it's illegal to harass a woman by making offensive comments about women in general, and I'm not sure if the same goes over here.
I think harassment laws here are far less defined than they are in the United States, unfortunately. But you bring in something really interesting, which is that whole gray zone of if you catch someone in the act and if it is a crime, how does, you know, entrapment factor into that? How does entrapment get mixed up? Because I think that what the producers, of course, don't want to happen is any red tape interfering with any criminal charges should they arise out of this. Yeah,
but sure, at the same time, just because harassment may not cross the threshold into criminal territory doesn't
mean it shouldn't be exposed.
It shouldn't be put out in the open. But how they expose that behavior is kind of a moral Pandora's box. On one hand, if you put a known offender in a situation where you know he'll act up, maybe the scales are tipped unfairly, but then again, he or she obviously shouldn't be doing that in the first place, no?
Well, here's what it does do. It walks that line, right, of exposing this misconduct, be it casual or criminal. But depending on how the show does it, it risks giving credence to those who argue this whole Me Too movement is escalating into a witch hunt against men, assigning them a criminal branding when they've actually committed no actual crime. So something I personally would like to see them do with this show is maybe even address that in the format itself, because as we know, sexual misconduct isn't always men against women. It can be a man against another man, a woman against another woman, and of course
even
it can be
a woman against a man. Well, the idea of catching this behavior and then actually confronting the person who did it, I can see why people are talking about this series, and it hasn't even started filming yet, but I'm going to be looking out for it. Thanks for joining us, Brett.
Sure.
All right, well, this may sound like something from a sci-fi movie, but get this. An Israeli startup says they don't need a therapist and they don't need to study your dreams to figure out if you're clinically depressed. They claim all they need are your old recorded phone calls and their new cutting-edge tech. You heard me right. VoiceSense says they're on the verge of diagnosing all kinds of mental illnesses, from depression to schizophrenia, with pretty much nothing but your voice. The idea may sound crazy at first, but the science behind it is surprisingly logical. The idea is that as your mental state changes, so do your voice patterns, which isn't a far cry from how your handwriting is said to change given major changes in your psyche. The company's actually been researching this idea since the year 2000, sorting through hours and hours of participants' voice recordings and mapping the changes against their mental state. Those findings have paved the way for an algorithm software that bypasses the meaning of our words and even which language we speak them in to come to a diagnosis by only looking at speech patterns. In other words, think of it as the exact opposite of a traditional therapist, with over 300 million people all over the world impacted by depression at least once in their lives. The company is now heading to clinical trials, and who knows, a breakthrough in global health could very well be on the horizon. Well, a successful digital business like eBay or Spotify typically has to go through massive amounts of data really, really fast. Now, while an artificially intelligent machine does a pretty good job of doing that for us, the best systems used today still combine machine learning with human input. And the Israeli company Crowdflower has one of the best systems there is. Well, here with more is the Israel manager of Crowdflower, Nati Catalan. All right, so first tell us about what Crowdflower does.
All right, so actually Crowdflower is a software as a service platform that enables machine learning experts and data scientists to actually acquire large data sets in order to train their machine learning algorithms, and then combines the human inside that specific loop of learning.
So give us some examples of the industries in which this, platform is used.
Let's take the basic example, which is very popular here, like autonomous vehicles. Okay, so we're trying, let's say there's a company and the company tries to develop an autonomous vehicle, and then that algorithm needs to train itself over millions and millions of images, right, of pedestrians, of bicycles, of vehicles, and so on. And then it actually, after a lot of training, it actually predicts. It sees, it goes out to the field and then sees that specific sign and predicts what that sign specifically is.
Very interesting.
If the confidence level is high, then the algorithm he knows the answer. But if the confidence level is low, then he has to route it back to humans all the time.
Right, which is interesting. So, but you are using, like you said, kind of a mix of human intelligence and artificial intelligence. Yeah. Okay. So I understand, that you participated in an AI conference last week. Can you tell us a little bit about what you guys were discussing there?
Yeah, I think this was the first artificial intelligence conference here in Israel, Future of AI. I think it was fabulous, and I think, there's going to be a lot coming in. We have seen a lot of customers over a lot of use cases throughout very much of unstructured data and everything that is related to it. That means we want to train algorithms to do a lot of things. Autonomous vehicles is one issue, but also reading and understanding tweets or Facebook posts or natural language processing in total. So there's a lot of use cases to run through, and there's a lot coming through.
All right. Well, I mean, I'm excited to kind of see the future of where AI ends up, and you guys are obviously at the top of the game, so we'll be looking out for you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Natasha.
All right. Well, here comes our Hebrew word of the day. One Israeli startup thinks their tech can be better at diagnosing depression than a therapist. So today's word is dikaon, or depression in Hebrew. Over 300 million people around the world are affected by dikaon, or depression. Dikaon is certainly nothing to laugh about. On top of that, dikaon is actually the #1 global cause of disability. A dikaon can take all kinds of forms: an emotional dikaon, a medical dikaon, and even an economic dikaon. It happens to almost everyone, so if a dikaon is happening to you, just remember there's always someone who knows how you feel. Don't be afraid to reach out and talk to someone about it. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight should be partly cloudy but warm with a low of 54 or 12 degrees Celsius. Tomorrow is expected to be sunny and with a rise in temperatures to a high of around 81 or 27 degrees Celsius. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.49 shekels to the American dollar. Remember to sign up for our daily newsletter at iltv.tv, and don't forget to follow us on Facebook at Israel English News and on Twitter at ILTV News. I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for watching.